It is Wednesday, April 18th, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett. I'm here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today is Chairman Al Scott. He is currently the chairman of the Chatham County Commission. He also represented Savannah and Chatham County in the Georgia House of Representatives from 1976 until 1983, and in the Georgia State Senate from 1983 and until 1990, when Governor-elect Zell Miller appointed him to serve as Georgia Commissioner of Labor, a position he held until 1993. In addition to his duties as Chatham County Commission Chair, Mr. Scott is also president of the Savannah branch of the NAACP and the recipient of numerous civic and leadership awards. Thank you very much, Chairman Scott, for taking some time this morning to talk history and politics with me. I was wondering if we could begin by telling me a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing.
Well, I grew up in the lanes and slums of Savannah. My family moved here when I was 5.5 years old. Prior to that, I was born in Effingham County and lived mostly with my grandmother, who was a sharecropper in Effingham. And so I have memories from back then. You didn't have nurseries to take kids to, or babysitters. So I have memories of cotton fields and tobacco barns and everything else of Effingham County as a very young kid, and then moving to Savannah and living in the lanes and slums of Savannah. But back then, we were not cognizant of the fact that we were in poverty or living in the slums. We just knew that we lived in the lane and there were folk lived in the street, and we didn't spend a lot of time dwelling on poverty.
So you graduated from, I believe, Beach High School, Alfred E. Beach High School, one of the oldest public schools in the state. Tell me about your early education experience and maybe how it affected your later life decisions and career choices.
Well, I suspect more than anything else what impacted my life decisions was probably those very early years that I spent with my grandmother. And then later in life, because my mother and father separated and eventually got a divorce, and living with a single parent, you learn pretty quick that you have to be independent. And when they are working, most of the time you own your own.
Right.
But I also had in my life what I refer to as forced religion. Is that you went to church, you were baptized, you didn't have a say in it as growing up, and that too had an impact on your life, because if you're a kid growing up and you're in church all the time and you're listening to the Ten Commandments and all that, that has a foundation portion of your life that's not easily depart with. And so that was sort of it in a nutshell. And then because I was living with a single parent with limited resources, I started work at a very young age. My first endeavor at work was shining shoes, and we lived in a row house on 39th Lane, and next door to us was a carpenter who drove cab at night and did carpenter work during the day, and he built me a shoe shine box, and I still have that box today and use it often to shine my own shoes. But he built me that shoe shine box, and I would go out to what I refer to, and the names are changed now, but neighborhood confectionaries, and set up shop to shine shoes in front of those establishments. And of course, sometimes I would venture out on Sunday mornings to shine shoes prior to church, and if I shined shoes on Sunday, half of what I made had to be put in the till at the church. That was my mother's insistence for allowing me to work on what she referred to the Sabbath.
Right, right. So you served in the U.S. Army for a time. Was that before or after college?
It was sort of in between.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me, you attended Armstrong back when it was Armstrong State?
Yes.
Tell me about that experience, going to college. What did you study? Did you become active in social and political affairs?
At that time, the focus at Armstrong was business, and that's what I studied. But I also took as elective political science and stuff like that. And at that time, there were very few minorities at Armstrong, virtually no blacks, and the whole student population at Armstrong now has reversed. I would imagine a third of the student body might be minorities at this point. And that's because of the curriculum they have out there, the health allied courses. But it was interesting. I also joined the JCs and Toastmaster and stuff like that. Those organizations are still around, but they're almost defunct now. In fact, they're trying to revive the JCs in Chatham County. And so it afforded me an opportunity to meet folk from all walks of life.
So tell me how you went from the college to the Army.
No, it really, I was out of school for a quarter, and then you get a draft notice. And so I was drafted, and of course, I probably could have got a deferment, but I elected not to. I figured I had to go either after or before, and I was strapped for money, so I just tried. I didn't try for a deferment. I went on, was drafted, and spent 2 years in the military.
And after you were done, you came back to Savannah?
Yeah.
And
worked. And then went back to school on a GI Bill.
Okay. And you went to work, like a lot of folks in Savannah in the area, at Union Camp? Or was that, were there a few stops before?
No, I worked at Union Camp, and, growing up, as I mentioned, I shined shoes. I had delivery jobs. I had I had newspaper routes. I had multiple jobs as a kid growing up. And so when I got back from the military, that semester, a quarter that I was out of school, the reason I was out of school, I took a summer job at Union Camp, and I stayed on beyond that summer quarter, and that's when I was drafted. And so I'd been out at Union Camp, I guess, 6 months.
Okay.
And when I was drafted, and back then I had what they referred to as recall rights. So when I came back from the Army, it was as if you'd worked for 2.5 years, because I'd accumulated 2 years of seniority because I could count my military time.
Okay.
And so I came back to work out there, and then while working out there, I went back to school and worked.
So tell me, how were you a politically interested? Were you interested in Savannah politics, local politics, state politics while you were working, or was it just one of those things that?
Let's just say I was a consumer of news and current events, and if you're a consumer of news and current events, you generally have opinions about politics and everything else that's in the news, and not only that, the personalities who are involved.
Sure.
And so, yes, I developed an early interest, and I also developed an interest when I was in the military, when I spent a year in Korea, where you didn't have much to do except for read the Stars and Stripes and listen to the American broadcast there from the Army radio, and I was in the military during the death of Martin Luther King, and others. So yes, iPhone started forming an opinion in terms of politics when I was in the military.
So how did you go from an interested consumer of news to jumping into the state house race?
Well,
there's a few years there, obviously.
I disagreed with the person who represented me in the state legislature on many issues. And instead of complaining about it, I decided that I would just jump in and give it a try. And I ran. I lost my very first election by some 16 votes.
But I'm sure that was tough to take. 16.
Well, it was tough, but I can remember as if it was yesterday. I was out knocking on doors on Saturday. Part of my district was downtown. And I was walking the historic district. Mm-hmm. And actually, I lived over in an area called Baldwin Park, and I was walking from Baldwin Park, Baldwin Park is just north of Victory Drive. And I was walking the district, and my intent was to walk all the way to Bay Street and walk back. And of course, I was working from a voters list, and back then the voters list was only available in alphabetical order. I had taken the alphabetical order list and converted it to street order. So I was working the streets and only registered voters. I was not going just random door to door. And it started pouring down rain. It was a Saturday afternoon, roughly 2 o'clock. And I decided that I would call it quits because I said, the die is cast. Everybody's made up their mind. And so I quit canvassing and went home. And then, so when I reflect on it, if I'd stayed out there 2 or 3 more hours, I probably could have drummed up 9 votes, which is what it would have taken to switch the election in my favor. So it's given me something to think about.
A life lesson.
Yeah, never give up on a task.
So you did run in '76 and won. What was it like when you got up to the Gold Dome, and was it everything you had?
No, it was disappointing.
How so?
Even from watching and listening to it on the radio and having visited the Capitol, I perceived that I would have a little more influence than I had when I got there. And I spent some time in the gallery when I was first elected, looking down at the members on the floor as they worked and trying to figure out how in the world some of these folk got elected, And I was thinking, I said, well, perhaps they might be down there thinking the same thing about me. How in the world that guy up there in the gallery got elected, So I'd given up on that and decided that the only way that you were going to have any influence whatsoever in the legislature as a freshman was through relationships. And I also came to the legislature at a time when there was just a rip-roaring, drag-out, knockdown race for Speaker between Tom Murphy, who had succeeded Speaker Smith, who had died, and Murphy was in the race of his life to become Speaker, and he was being challenged by Al Burrs. And this is not to say anything negative. It was the way business was done. Al Burrs was traveling around the state, passing out contribution checks to folk who were running for the legislature. Murphy came down to Chatham County to purposely meet with me because he had supported my opponent and wanting to know if there was anything he could do to convince me to vote for him. And I told him that I had not made up my mind. And it was funny is that, he was prematurely talking about committee assignments and stuff like that. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Speaker, I said, I'm new to this business, but I'm not totally naive. You're not going to appoint a freshman to any committee of any substance. So even if I asked for a committee of substance, I would doubt that I would get it. So I said, let me just say this, is I'd like to serve on reapportionment. And then after that, you can just put me on whatever committee you need to put me on as a placeholder. I said, now if I'm successful in returning in 2 years, I get to select any committees I want. He says, son, you got a deal. And that's where we left it. But he did caution me. He said, if I put you on reapportionment, I won't take you off. I don't know why you want to be on it. It's a do-nothing committee. It only works every 8 years, gearing up for the census. He said it doesn't do much. But we cut that deal. And when I came back, I got the committees I wanted. And while he was doing his placeholders for me, I ended up on a committee that he had that was mainly dealt with public safety and automobiles, and we were dealing with, at that time, seatbelt laws.
Oh, sure.
Motorcycle helmets, and it was the Motor Vehicles Committee.
DUI was that a?
Well, what was surprising is that's when I first met Johnny Isaacson. He, as a Republican, was on that committee, and so I got to know him, and we traveled around the state and all that, and it was interesting because when I met Johnny, he was working for his father with Northside Realty.
Sure.
And so I got to know him, a young Johnny Isaacson, and then he's still in politics, and I'm still in politics. So we've known each other for a long time.
Tell me about that you came in the late 70s. Tell me about the Republican Party of Georgia. You couldn't have had more than, you could probably fit the entire Republican caucus in this section of the office here from back then. What were the Republicans like, and what was the working relationship like between you and them?
You did. For instance, in our 6-person delegation, we had one Republican from Chatham County. And I suspect that was true in Muskogee and Richmond and the other urban areas.
Sure.
So the majority of the Republicans in the legislature at that time was from the counties they're from now. They were from Gwinnett County, they were from Cobb County, Cherokee County, they were from Fulton County. That constituted the majority of the Republicans. And I made some very good friends to this day that I'm still friends with who were Republicans.
You were also, this was later on, but chairman of the Legislative Black Caucus. What can you tell me about the similarities and dissimilarities between the priorities of the Legislative Black Caucus and, say, the priorities of a Speaker Murphy or the Democratic caucus at large in the 70s and 80s?
Well, the caucus had a list of things that they were trying to accomplish. For one, we were trying to increase our numbers at the time, not to the extent of where we're at now. I think that we've lost sight of what it really takes to be effective as a caucus by pursuing not swing districts, but districts that minorities can win outright. And so that it's sort of changed. But for instance, we had a priority. We were against the death penalty. We were trying to promote at that time a Martin Luther King holiday in Georgia. Again, we were working on reapportionment. And even way back then, we were talking about the changing of the flag, which was symbolic.
Sure.
And those were things that was not high on the radar of most folk. Of course, you had some liberal Republicans who were in line with us on the death penalty, who were not objecting to the flag being changed.
Right.
They were certainly aligned with us on reapportionment because they felt they would benefit from it. And so you had, in some cases, strange bedfellows. But when I ran for chairman of the caucus, it was extremely difficult because I had left the House and moved to the Senate, and no one from the Senate has ever chaired the caucus. And mainly because we only had, when I got to the Senate, I was the fourth member in terms of blacks in the Senate. And even when I ran as chair of the caucus, there were only 6 black members of the Senate. And so the majority of the caucus members were in the House,
Sure.
Some 22 at the time. And so I was running against a professor from the Atlanta campus up there, Representative Bob Holmes, Dr. Holmes. And I won a very close race, if I recall, only by 2 or 3 votes did I win that race. And then I didn't run for re-election as caucus chair. I found it just all demanding and consuming by having to address the issues of everybody in that caucus, and it took away from, in my opinion, from my effectiveness as a member of the legislature.
You mentioned that moving up from the House to the Senate in '82.
Because the Speaker said I was moving down. So you referred to it as moving up, but maybe it was.
Well, what led you to make the leap from the lower house to the Senate?
I had not planned.
Okay.
I had not planned to. We had the 1980 census. I ran for re-election in '80 to the House, and then we did the reapportionment in '81, and for the elections in '82. And since the local delegation said, well, since you're on the reapportionment committee, we're charging you with doing or redrawing the House and Senate districts. And so I did. And so we created what I refer to as a swing Senate district. It was roughly close to 60% minority, at 60% black, 58-42 or something in that range. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a district where anyone of any race could win, depending on your politics. And so I had drawn that district. The incumbent wasn't running for re-election, so he had no objections to it because he was running for Congress. And in his run for Congress, which was Senator Wessels, he really needed minority votes, and so he was perfectly fine with whatever I did with that Senate district. So when you didn't have to deal with an incumbent in the Senate district, you don't have an issue. And then the other incumbent senator at that time was Senator Tom Coleman, who was an early chairman of the county commission, and someone that I got to know and became very, very close to over the years. And so he was only concerned as long as I wasn't doing too much to his district. And then he and I lived very close together, so we had to come up with a dividing line. And I lived on Victory Drive, which if you were to assign a numerical number to it, it would be 43rd Street.
Okay.
And he lived on 46, just to put it in perspective. And so we lived about 4.5 blocks from each other, 5 blocks max.
Sure.
And so we used Victory Drive as a dividing line, sort of the north-south dividing line, to make certain that we didn't do that. Then we also split up the municipalities intentionally. We didn't want all the municipalities in any one Senate district to have them to play an overwhelming role in electing whoever was the state Senate. So we carved up the municipalities and the districts, and then I had thought of someone who I had a good relationship with, and was a representative from here who got elected in the late 60s from here. The first black to go back to the legislature since Reconstruction was Bobby Hill. And Bobby was the lead advocate on abolishing the death penalty in Georgia. In fact, he argued the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And so Bobby was in political trouble at home in his House district. Reapportionment, he'd gone from a 91% minority district to about a 76% minority district. He was in political trouble, and I offered the Senate seat to him. I said, Bobby, why don't you run for the Senate since you're facing heavy opposition in your House district? And he said he wasn't interested. He had all that seniority accumulated. He was chair of the Special Duty Committee, I believe, at the time, and he didn't want to leave the House. He eventually lost his election. But the Senate district was drawn for him. And then since he wouldn't take it, I decided that we didn't want anybody inexperienced in the legislature to serve in the Senate. And so I elected to run.
Tell me about the difference between the House and the Senate, beyond the basics. What's the difference in the tone and the sort of things only somebody who served there under Zell Miller could
the real difference is the House, you have 180 members, all elected from districts. Some districts have no minority influence whatsoever. In the Senate, you've got those 56 members, and I would say over half of them have got minority influence in their district. That if they were in a very close race, the minority could make the difference in the district. So you could easily, if you didn't want anything that was too extreme, you could easily garner support for efforts that was beneficial to the minority community in the Senate more so than in the House. And not only that, because you only had 56 members, you got to know the members very well. You only needed 29 to pass anything. And so if you form a coalition, you can get a lot done. And Tom Coleman and I formed a coalition that I would work on what he referred to. Of course, I worked on the minorities and the liberal members of the Senate if we had an issue. He would work on the conservative members of the Senate if we had an issue. And that's how we would forge. And we would both work Republicans. Some Republicans I would work, some we wouldn't. And Republicans were helpful in a lot of ways. You had Paul Coverdale, who was considered a liberal Republican, but he wrote herd over retirement legislation. Anything that he thought was a giveaway or something to benefit a member of the Senate, or anybody in elected office, he was totally against it. And he wrote herd over that kind of stuff. And I had an issue. We just elected a new governor in George Busby, and I was trying to get what I call one of Savannah's most noted citizens in the person of Gene Gaston, who had worked this community as an assistant county attorney at one point, and he had also worked as a workman comp judge. I was trying to get him appointed to the Superior Court. Had a commitment from the governor to appoint him, Governor Busby. The problem was, and I didn't know it, I didn't go around doing a survey on how old people was, but Gene had already attained the mandatory retirement age at that time for Superior Court judges, or 65. It was mandatory retirement. And so he was at the mandatory retirement age, so he couldn't be appointed. because he couldn't participate because he was already at the mandatory retirement age. So I had to amend the Superior Court Act in Georgia to carve out an exception to allow the governor to appoint Gene Gaston to the Superior Court. And Paul Coverdale was standing in my way, so because he was very active with the retirement committee. And I had to go over and hold meetings with him, and he helped me draft an exception to get Gene Gaston appointed to the Superior Court. And you may not think that's significant today, but that made Gene Gaston the only black Superior Court judge outside of Fulton County in Georgia.
Not even not even in Southwest Georgia, there weren't superior.
No other.
Wow.
No other district Superior Court outside of Fulton County had a minority judge, and
that's not too long ago.
That's not too long ago, and so when you think about it, and then when you start talking about Coverdale, he chaired the Fulton County delegation as a Republican. The senior member of that delegation was Julian Bond. Julian Bond had to pass on chairing the delegation in order for Coverdale, who was next in line in seniority, to chair the Fulton County delegation. So he had a very close working relationship with Julian Bond.
Julian Bond came in 66, 68, so he would have been senior.
Yeah, he came in the House.
6 years.
Yeah, and he left the House and came over to the Senate.
Right.
And he came over to the Senate in the 70s, and prior to that, he was in the House in the 60s. And so that Julian had, like I said, a very close working relationship with him. Yeah.
Zell Miller would have been lieutenant governor when you moved up to the state Senate. Tell me about Governor Miller. Of course, he just passed away not too long ago. What was he like?
Well, you know, when I first met him, I had a friend a guy named Jack Flanagan, who ran the Park Lane Lounge, which was sort of a political watering hole primarily for white poles, white politicians, and Jack called me one night. I was at home. He said, "Can you come by the lounge?" I used to stop by there occasionally, and he said, "I got somebody I want you to meet." This was in early '74, and it was Zell Miller. He says, "You know Zell, don't you? I know you've heard of him. You know, he's on pardon and parole. He was on pardon and paroles. He he chaired the executive director of the Democratic Committee, and he was the one that kept Lester Maddox sane. You know, he was his executive secretary." So that was my first introduction to Zell before he was elected. And Jack said, "I need you to help me with Zell in Chatham County to carry the county." And at that time, before we were, the NAACP was very active in politics, and because we got orders from the national NAACP to cease and desist, but at some point, but we were very active, and if you wanted to carry Chatham County, you had to get the blessing of the NAACP, or you couldn't carry it because you couldn't get the black vote.
Right.
And so we were successful in helping Zell get the endorsement of the Political Action Committee, the NAACP, and I helped him in his campaign in '74. I was running as well, so it was an easy thing for me to do, to pass out his literature while I was passing out mine.
Sure.
And so he got elected, and I was 9 votes short. And so I got to know him before he was lieutenant governor, so 2 years later when I got elected, we'd already had a friendship established. And so it was an easy time. But when you ask the real difference in the Senate, when I left the House with Murphy asking me not to leave, and I left anyway. When I went to the Senate, I wasn't chairing any committee in the House. When I went to the Senate as a freshman, I was a committee chair. Yeah. And I also had an office in the Capitol. And it was because of my relationship with Zell. And so I went from being nobody in the House to a potential player in the House to a player in the Senate. And just with one election. And so it was much easier to get things done for me in the Senate than it was in the House.
Now, what committee was that you were chairing?
I chaired several committees in the Senate. I chaired Children and Youth, but the Consumer Affairs. My first committee was Consumer Affairs, and then Children and Youth. And from that, I chaired the committee is now the Industry and Public Utilities Committee, is how it's known today.
So I remember reading.
But I also served on appropriations. I was secretary to the Rules Committee.
So Rules and Appropriations.
Oh yeah.
So I think
and in the chair. So I was
right.
part of the leadership caucus.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, one of the topics that came up, doing my research for this interview was something that's still in the news, Plant Vogtle, and your efforts on that matter. And I wanted to get the historical context, and then tell me what you with your expertise, what you understand, what's going on with Plant Vogtle.
Well, what they eventually adopted at Plant Vogtle is what I was proposing
1985, I believe it was.
Years ago. And that was some sort of phase-in into the rate base early on so you could accumulate the money to avoid rate shock when it came online, which was really what we were after, to simplify it.
Right.
And we got all sorts of opposition, but a lot of the opposition was just opposition to nuclear power, period. So we had people on both sides of the fence. We had strange bedfellows in that argument. And for instance, we had the Pierre Howards of the world who was against it. And part of it, and I'll have to go back and check, but I even believe Governor Deal voted against it back then. And because I remember him making an argument in the well against it. But it was not very well received, although we passed it in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And then it failed in the House. But that goes to show the influence that we had in the Senate at the early age, early with virtually no seniority to be able to pass it. When I tackled that in '85, I'd been in the Senate for 3 years,
right.
for really 2 years. And so it was quite a lift. But I always felt that if you were going to clean up the environment, that nuclear power had to be a part of it. And so we had to move in that direction. And that's before some of the achievements that's been made in perfecting solar.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Or windmills or anything else. And I was a proponent of nuclear power. And to this day, I still think it has to be part of the mix.
Like President Obama said, the all the above approach. Well, what drew you to public utilities? Yeah, I guess consumer affairs, public utilities, the Public Service Commission.
Well, what really happened is that, and we were running sort of a running joke, and a guy who worked for Zell Miller, Cap Hicks. I don't know if you remember that name or researched that name, but he came over to my desk and he says that the lieutenant governor would like to know if you're interested in chairing a committee, and what committee would you like to chair, So I said, tell the lieutenant governor that I'd be happy chairing appropriations or rules. And Cap Hicks bust out laughing. He said, "You want me to tell him that?" I said, "Yeah." So he goes back to the diocese and he tells Zell that, and you could see Zell. He had that gavel and he was just laughing his butt off, And he said, "Go back and tell the freshman senator that he has to crawl before he can walk." So Cap came back with that message and I was laughing. And then Cap had given me a list of potential committees. And I went with the Consumer Affairs with the understanding that a committee that would be considered of more importance became available that I would be considered for. And so I was on Consumer Affairs, and it was in all sorts of god-awful things, everything from nude dancing to anything alcohol. And I thought I couldn't chair that committee for an extended period of time without getting really soiled. So I really asked when had an opportunity to chair the Children and Youth, I asked if I could chair that committee. And so I went from Consumer Affairs to Children and Youth. And by the way, working in that capacity, I was able to pass what's known as the Child Abuse Trust Fund, and was able to do a funding set aside, which Murphy hated, dedicated revenue on divorce filings to fund the Child Abuse Trust Fund. So I had to do two things. I had to pass a constitutional amendment in the House and the Senate and get voters' approval, and then enabling legislation in order to create that. And I did that my first year as chair of the Children and Youth Committee. And then from that, the Industry and Public Utilities Committee came available. I got on that committee, and I just spent a lot of time, since we practiced oversight over the Public Service Commission, I spent a lot of time becoming the utility expert in the Senate. Not just looking at power generation, but telecommunication, everything else.
Now, what year did you become chairman? Because you made a run for the Public Service Commission in 1990?
1990, yeah.
What was it your experience in that oversight role that made you consider being on the commission itself?
I didn't think very highly of members of the Public Service Commission. We had some real characters at the time, and I decided that I would take one of them on, one that had been there for a long time, an incumbent who had accumulated a lot of favors and a lot of money. And what you find yourself as a Public Service Commission, you have virtually no constituents. The public wants you to deny all rate increases. As a member, you really can't do that. If so, you'll just be overturned by the courts. So you have no constituents. You can't accept contributions from utilities because you're their governing.
Right.
And so you can't, it's raising money is like pulling hen teeth. And so I got out there and underfunded and find that it was impossible to win. I think I could have had a shot if there was another person in the race and I could have gotten to a runoff, but it was just impossible. It was just too big of a lift.
Well, you didn't have to wait long to find a job after running for Public Service Commission.
Oh, but I didn't seek the Labor Commissioner's job.
What? Tell me about the phone call or the communication you had with Governor Miller that made him impress upon you.
Well, I thought two things. I was very involved when I was in the state Senate. I was there for 8 years. I was spending so much time away, it was taking a toll on me trying to advance at work. I was working full time.
It's a part-time legislature.
Part-time legislature. So I decided that if I got involved in politics, I had to do something full time, or I had to get out because I needed to worry about getting promoted at work. Just thinking about my future.
Right.
And so I tried to make that leap, but I was not interested in being labor commissioner. And I was at work, and I got a call, and it was Zell Miller, the secretary, answered the phone, and I was not in the office at the time. And she paged me, and she says, "You got a call, and the governor would like for you to call him back as soon as possible." So I called him back, and he said, "When are you coming to Atlanta?" And I said, "Well, I'm scheduled to be up there next week for a committee meeting or something I had up there." And he said, "Well, can you come before then?" I said, "I could possibly come up there on Friday." And we set a time, and I went up to see him, and he said, "I want you to be part of my administration." He said, "You and I have been friends. I consider you one of my best friends, and I want you to be part of my administration." And I got to thinking, I really didn't want to work for the governor. I liked the guy, I loved the guy, but I don't know. I thought working for him would change that relationship. And so I really wasn't interested in one of the administrative jobs. And so he said, "What if the current labor commissioner was offered other opportunities?" And he was talking about Commissioner of Natural Resources. Mm-hmm. And he was in reference to Joe Tanner at the time. And he said, that's where his heart's at, that's what he loves. What if he had an opportunity to go back there and there was no labor commissioner? Would you consider an appointment to labor commissioner? And I said, "I don't know, Governor, let me think about it." So I thought about it for about a week, and I didn't call him back, and he called me and said, "I need an answer." And that's how I got there.
So he convinced you, or did you come around to the end?
Well, he convinced me that he wanted me to be a part of his administration, because when I got to be labor commissioner, that office is completely independent of the governor's office to a great degree, with the exception that the governor can decide where a lot of federally funded programs are housed, such as the Job Training Partnership Act and all the stuff now that people are doing that they refer to as rapid training, advanced training for industry, and all that. All that stuff was housed in the Labor Department as part of that deal. That's where Governor Miller put them, and that's where they're at during my tenure as labor commissioners. A lot of that's been taken from that department, and the governor's produced a watch. So I went over there, and then that department, the labor department, is 98, 99% federally funded. So you have very few threats from the legislature in terms of your budget. You're independent of the governor. I can remember I got cross with the governor on when he wanted to do agency shutdowns for budgetary reasons.
Right.
And to me, it made no sense to shut down the Department of Labor when it's federally funded. It has no impact on your budget. And if you're going to lay people off, and especially if it's furloughing them for more than 2 weeks, they're going to show up at the Labor Department. And so that's one agency that you need to keep open. And we had a disagreement about that, and I really think that my independence probably soured our relationship to some extent.
Now, you ran to complete the term, because that was
but this is an office not worth running for. But I committed when I accepted it that I would run.
Okay. So that you faced. There was a primary election
Yeah.
And you were defeated in the primary and then went back into...
No, I was, in the primary process, I was defeated.
Sure.
David Portruff, who was Secretary of State and who had lost in a gubernatorial, I think in the primary, and he was running. He decided he would get in my race, and I was the top vote getter. We went to a runoff. I couldn't get my votes back.
And so in the runoff.
Runoff, yeah.
So after that, you finally committed to your full-time career.
Yeah.
Did you stay active or obviously stayed active and interested in politics, but...
I had to stay active because I had to raise money to pay off a debt, a loan that we acquired when I was running for Labor Commissioner.
Right.
So I stayed active a couple of years just trying to raise money to pay off that debt. And then from there, I was not active for a couple of years, but I was always involved at the local level. Mm-hmm. And then when Miller completed his term, and when Governor Bonds was running, I was always a supporter of his. You know, when we had that huge race, when you had Bonds, Miller, Andy Young, Underwood, and a bunch of them running for governor, mm-hmm. and I was one of the few blacks in the state who was supporting Miller over Andy Young. In fact,
right.
We tried to talk Andy into running for lieutenant governor, and he wouldn't hear of it. And so I also think that I got a little bit of a punishment in Metro Atlanta when I was running for my activities in the Miller race earlier. But that's just politics.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So you came back and you were chair of the county Democratic Party down here in Chatham in the late 90s.
Well, that's when I said I stayed involved at the local level. I chaired the Chatham County Democratic Committee, mm-hmm. and so I was involved in politics locally. And when I wasn't chairing it, I was on it. So I was active in that sense, and so I'd never really given up on politics, just given up on elected office. And then when Miller tenure was over and Governor Bonds got elected, he asked me to serve on the state school board. You know, you had a representative from each congressional district.
Right.
So he appointed me to the state school board. That was awful duty. I served there for a year and really begged off.
What was so bad?
Well, you know, we met in Atlanta, and we were sort of really the appeals court for grievances at local school systems. And then we had a female school superintendent who was Republican. Mm-hmm. I won't call her name.
Easy enough to figure out.
And you know, and that board sort of practiced oversight over her department, and she was god awful. And then you sit there and you listen to grievance parents who've had a grief with the local school board, or you are hearing from a charter school applicant who was turned down at the local level and who had appealed it to the state school board. And then you had arguments being presented from the local school board as why they shouldn't have it. Then you got the people who were the charter talking about all the good things they're going to do to educate kids. And that's basically what that board did, you know. And so it was tough duty. And to do that job, you're supposed to have hearings in each of your school systems in your congressional district annually.
Okay.
And so by the time you do that, and most of those hearings are in the evening so parents can participate.
Sure.
And that's quite a chore.
It sounds incredibly taxing.
Yeah.
On time and patience.
Yeah, so, I had to beg off of that.
So
And so the governor was very kind. He said, okay, I'll take you off of that. What about the Port Authority? And so he put me on the Port Authority.
Well, I drove in this morning, came down from through Port Wentworth, nothing but tractor trailers, container trucks.
Yeah, and Keith Mason, who was Zell Miller's executive secretary for a period of time before he went to join the Clinton administration. And of course, I was labor commissioner during some of those meetings that the governors mentioned when Clinton was gearing up to run for president. And I remember being in meetings with him. I had the governor's mention, and along with Carville and others. And Carville, at the time, was being, I guess this is not a proper term, but it was being kept to some extent by Miller. He was being paid by the Democratic Committee to sort of stay on retainer for Governor Miller's re-election. And Governor Miller convinced Bill Clinton that he needed to sign on with Carville. And that sort of launched Carville's career and Paul's and to some extent Bill Clinton's.
Sure.
And so the governor remained friends to death with Carville and Paul Bogata forever. So.
Well, of course, we were both up at Governor Miller's memorial service.
Yep.
And two of those, Mr. Mason, President Clinton, Paul Bogata, they were all there.
Yeah, and in fact, Paul was the speaker at the service at the college at Young Harris the day before. And when they launched the foundation, he was one of the speakers there, along with Andy Young, the Miller Institute. When they launched that,
right?
When Brian launched that, he was there for that. So politics have strange bedfellows.
Right. Everything seems to come full circle. So you said that you were swearing off elective office, but we're sitting here in the chairman, CEO of Chatham County Commission. That's an elected post.
Yes, it is.
What brought you back in?
Well, you know, I would often go out and muse with friends about, and they would always try to talk me into getting back in an elected office. They tried to talk me into running for mayor. And I said, I'm not interested in being mayor. I said, what are you interested in? I said, if I was going to run for anything local, it would be chairman of the county commission. I said, because the chairman has a lot more influence than does the mayor. It's not perceived by the public.
Sure.
The public perceives the mayor as being the most influential person, and that's fine. But the person who has really a lot more input is the chair of the county commission. And of course, the mayor of Savannah has a lot of input in half of the county's population, but not near the authority or the influence of the chairman.
What did you hope to achieve coming in?
I had a list, a laundry list of things. I was not without, things I wanted to change.
Right.
And some of it is that I thought that Zell was onto something when he attempted and never really achieved it to try to go to zero-based budgeting at the state level. And so I implemented that at the county level. It's much easier to do at the county level than it is at the state level.
Sure.
And you don't have near the pushback. Part of the problem at the state level is that you have all these department heads who are elected, be it the agriculture, school superintendent, labor commissioner, and they all have constituents, not only among the citizens at large, but they also have constituents in the legislature. So it's a tough, but I was able to implement that locally without a lot of pushback. The county, in my opinion, spent money in good times on projects that they shouldn't, and they did it without much planning. So one of the things I wanted to do was implement a strategic long-range plan for the county and let that plan drive spending, not just whims of county commissioners decide, well, we got money, I want this in my district, I want this in my district. I wanted that long-range plan to drive spending.
Right.
I wanted to do that. I really wanted to foster a better working relationship between all the municipalities and the county government. So we implemented regular meetings with the managers of all the municipalities and the manager of the county. The other thing that was important is that we were in the midst of a retiring county manager, so I decided to do a nationwide search for a new county manager. And so I had an opportunity to kind of restructure county government. So it's been an exciting almost 6 years.
Well, what's going on in Chatham County right now? What's the future look like for Chatham County?
Oh, I think the future is terrific, but this county isn't any different than some of the other counties in the state. Some of the issues are what I call statewide. You got people who wanting to incorporate these little cities everywhere.
Right.
I always felt that you ought to consolidate government. I don't think that that's the views of the majority in the county when I'm talking about the public at large or the voters. I think there are some synergies and could be some efficiencies, but I don't think that you ought to overpromise or oversell stuff that you can't deliver. I don't do that as chairman. I don't make promises that I can't keep. And you ought to look at consolidating services. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. I don't necessarily have a willing partner in the municipalities. Everybody, the purpose of laying turf is to protect it. And so you got a lot of turf protecting at the expense of the taxpayer. But I take the view that there's only one taxpayer for the most part in local government, and that is the property owner. And then it's subsidized to some extent with sales tax dollars. And most of those sales tax initiative was passed with the intentions of rolling back property taxes that really haven't materialized to a very minor degree. Have property taxes been rolled back at municipal levels. And so eventually, I think long term that we'll have to do some form of consolidation, or you'll find all the unincorporated area will go out like they have in Fulton pretty much and form some little small municipalities, and we'll run that cycle for a while. And then after a while, they'll find out that that's not really the most profitable, most efficient way to do business. And then at that point, we might end up with consolidation here.
Well, we were talking before the cameras turned on about that. I jokingly called it the evolution of the two-party system. I wonder if we could zoom out and talk about the changes in the two-party system since you were involved in politics back in the 70s to today.
You see, and you and I were kidding about the fact that I don't think it was a evolution.
No? Tell me your thoughts on the two-party system, and we were talking about how there were a handful of Republicans in the legislature when you started.
I think there have been a majority of Republicans in the legislature for as long as I can remember. There was a majority there when I served. However, some had D's by the name and some had R's by the name. It just happened to be the majority of them had D's by the name. But they were really Republican in Democratic clothing.
So we're talking conservatives.
I'm talking people who were more conservative than today's Republican Party. Tom Murphy was as conservative as any Republican that's ever been elected as a fiscal perspective. You didn't get any more conservative than he was. And so I think you had a lot of folk who were Republicans who ran as Democrats. And they ran as Democrats because the governor was a Democrat. And if you wanted to get things done, it was said that you need to run as a Democrat. That happened locally. We had a Republican member of our delegation. When I served, it was Herb Jones and Ann Mueller, who were Ann Mueller replaced Herb Jones, but we were able to work with them. And then you had what I refer to, rather than an evolution, you had a coming out party. That's a better way of putting it. You had a coming out party, and I really think that it may have gotten started to some extent with Governor Miller. I doubt if he would take credit for it because he used to say that Berta was a Democrat, he was born a Democrat, and he would die a Democrat. Now, you can talk about his activities at the national level and when he was in the Senate and whether or not that was a Democratic or Republican, but you can make any argument you want. But I think that in his heart he was a Democrat. But I thought he contributed to what I refer to as the coming out party. There was inklings of it very early on when Zell ran against Herman Talmadge. It was a brutal Democratic primary. It really exposed a lot of flaws of Talmadge that a lot of folk knew and thought or imagined was now exposed. And that allowed a little-known Republican from St. Simon to get elected to the U.S. Senate in the person of Matt Manley, the first person elected to the U.S. Senate from Georgia since Reconstruction. So if you really want to analyze that, you would have to say that Miller contributed to Manley election.
Sure.
And because Manley served one term and then was defeated by a Democrat. And then the Democrats who defeated him was not as conservative as the Georgia population.
Right. White Fowler.
And so you had this deal where you can make an argument that Max Cleveland, who served in the U.S. Senate, and White Fowler was not as conservative as Georgia. And then you had a what I refer to as a liberal Republican in the person of Paul Coverdale, and he later became more conservative, but he was a liberal Republican, and who had been appointed as director of Peace Corps by President George Herbert Walker Bush. And because he was his Southeast campaign coordinator for George Herbert Walker Bush, and this is back during the voodoo economic days when Bush was running against Reagan. And so you had Paul, who come back from the Peace Corps and who runs for the Senate, who a transformation. He was well known in Metro Atlanta from all his years have serving in the state legislature, and he was an acceptable Republican, even to some minority groups. And he got elected statewide. He was liberal enough for some Democrats and conservative enough for most Republicans. And so that's really what I refer to as the coming out of the Republican Party. A little bit with Manley, not so much. A lot with Paul Coverdale, having been elected.
Were you surprised in 2002 when Sonny Perdue, a former Democrat, state senator, defeated Roy Barnes, the incumbent?
I was surprised up until the last 4 or 5 days of the election when I could just feel it. Up until then, I said, no way. But now, a lot transpired before that happened.
Oh, sure.
And
which explanation?
You think about this.
To?
You had Sonny Perdue with no seniority. They elected him president pro tem of the Senate as a Democrat. And then you had a state senator from Augusta named Charles Walker, who had left the House and moved over to the Senate, who was big allies with Governor Bond. And a horrific fundraiser was Walker. Now, and Walker wanted to be majority leader in the Senate, running against people with a lot more seniority and a lot more mainstream in the Senate. He was successful with the help of Governor Bonds to become majority leader of the Senate. The majority leader in the Senate has a lot more authority than the president pro tem in the Senate. And so I think that that in itself led to what I call the friction between Sonny Perdue and Walker, and to some extent Governor Bonds, and Sonny deciding that he would resign his post as president pro tem since he couldn't occupy it once he switched parties. And then he switched parties, switched to the Republican camp, and decided, he didn't really switch parties. Let's just say he switched back to the Republican Party, because he was very active with the Republican Party in Houston County, even in elected office and other positions prior to coming to the Senate. And he was encouraged to run as a Democrat for the Senate. I remember his campaign very well. I got to know him during the time he was running for the Senate. And so he went back to the Republican Party. I won't say switched to the Republican Party. He went back to the Republican Party for the sole purpose of mounting a campaign. And he wanted to mount a campaign to expose, I guess, what he thought some of the issues that he had with Governor Bonds and with Senator Walker. And when he ran, I thought he was a long shot, to say the least. I didn't think he had a ghost of a chance of winning. And the longer that election went on, the more that he started gaining support, almost like the support Joe Frank Harris had gotten from the legislature when he defeated Bo Ginn for governor. You could feel that sort of the legislature shifting to Sonny, and he ended up winning a close election. And then it's always tough to defeat an incumbent governor. And then you also have to keep on. Then he presided sort of what was already, the invitations were out for the coming out party. They were sent by Coverdale, earlier by Madeline, that say that we may have a coming out party at some day. Then Coverdale sort of sent out the invitation. And the invitation was sort of out there when Miller re-election, when he ran against Guy Milner and barely squeaked by.
Right.
So that was the beginning of the coming out. And so as Sonny started encouraging folk to switch parties. And that's really was the coming out of the Republican Party. So you have to stop and think. The original majority in the House and the Senate was made because Democrats switched parties to the Republican Party.
Right.
That's created the first majority, and then you had a chance to do reapportionment, and you started drawing more conservative districts. They even got where they were doing mid-census reapportionment to create even more conservative districts, and that was to be able to hold on to that majority. But the majority was more of a coming out party than some sort of evolution that eventually the whole state was growing. I think that they made the state conservative. It wasn't, I don't think the state moved. I think they moved and brought the state with them.
The Democrats have been out of power since 2003, the governor's mansion. Then, as we talked about, the legislature followed behind. Mm-hmm. Why have Democrats been unable to mount a really competitive challenge to the Republican majority since that time?
I just think that it's a tough row to hoe. Let's just put it that way. That you you have to run in a primary. And then the misgiving by Democratic candidates that you've got to be as right as the Republican. When I said right on issues.
Right.
To the right of the center. And I always think that you're better off in the center. But in order to get elected in the primary, you usually move left, and then in the general you try to move right. And usually the distance is too wide to make up. You just can't do it. And that's part of the problem. But the other thing, if you look at, with the exception of Governor Bond getting back into it in an election that I questioned whether or not his heart was in it.
This is 2010.
Yeah, and he's certainly one of the smartest governors that we've ever elected. But I don't think that his campaign was well managed. And that's not to criticize anybody. I think that the strategy that was used to manage his very first election as governor was well, but that needed to evolve because everything else was evolving. The coming out party was taking place. You had to take all of that in consideration. Mm-hmm. I don't think all of that was taken into consideration at the time. So that was indeed an issue as well. But I think that we haven't selected or nominated the right candidates, and we haven't run on the right issues. And that lies the problem. Now, everybody is saying, well, we need to wait on the demographics.
That was my next question.
They said we need to wait on the demographics. Now, Georgia has moved from being 11th or 12th to 8th in population in this state, and that's based on the 2017 census estimates. That they're now the 8th largest state. You know, they've passed places like New Jersey, Michigan, and so Georgia is a real player now in terms of the 8th largest state. And so we've had a lot of new constituents. Yes, the demographics has changed, some minority. The influx of Hispanics will make a difference in this state. You just need to look at Gwinnett County and Cobb County now.
Right.
And so, or even Henry County. And so that's changed. But you've also had what I call northern liberal Republicans have moved to the state. And you've had what I call moderate Republicans from Florida has moved back north, have originally moved all the way to Florida, and now they come back just to get away from the hurricane, and they stop in Georgia. Some of them go as far north as North Carolina. And so that's where the growth has come from. And so our politics have to evolve to address the changes in attitude that the population changes have brought about. Instead, we're sitting here waiting on the demographics to change to get back in power. I don't think that that's necessary. I think this upcoming governor's election, if we nominate what I refer to as the right Stacy, would be a real test as to whether or not its demographics are issues.
Have you already endorsed in that race, or?
I have not publicly endorsed. I have made a contribution in that race, and my contribution is with Stacey Evans.
So, the greatest threat to Democrats, a lot of people said, was they just became complacent in power for so long that they just didn't see that coming out party. They didn't think it was a real threat.
They weren't complacent in power. There weren't anything complacent about it. And if you stop and think, Joe Frank Harris talked about two Georgias. He talked about developmental highways. He wasn't on broadband. Now you got Nathan Deal talking about Rural Economic Development Commission. and broadband. He's saying the same thing that Joe Frank Harris was saying. Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't any difference. Rural Georgia's been left behind. We don't have Democratic candidates running addressing rural Georgia. Now, you've had a tremendous population shift away from rural Georgia.
Right.
Now, will you ever get it back? No. A lot of the mom and pop farm has been bought out by conglomerates. All you need to do is just ride through South Georgia and look at what's now the new farms. But Georgia still have a very vibrant farm economy. That has to be in your political mix. It cannot be ignored. And then you start thinking, well, the last couple of candidates, Joe Frank Harris was from North Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Nathan, who served his entire time in the legislature as a Democrat. He was on the bench as a Democrat. He got elected to Congress as a Democrat to replace Ed Jenkins. And it was not until Newt was running for Speaker of the House that he switched parties. And stayed in Washington for almost 20 years. Now, he was about perhaps as out of touch with Georgia as anybody we've elected in recent times. But he was able to run on issues that he thought that would appeal to Georgians and got elected after a contested primary, a runoff,
mm-hmm.
and a general. So, and you cannot tell me that Nathan is a dynamic, ideal candidate. He is not. He's a good person, presents himself well. Back when I served with him, he was chair of the Hall County Deacon Board, the First Baptist Church. So, and he's a family person, a devoted family person. He's all those things. But it was the issues that got him elected.
It's a little early. But what do you think Governor Deal's legacy is going to be in this state from the issues or
You know what?
Yeah.
I don't think any governor has had a legacy in recent time. You may say Carter because he went from a term-limited governor of a single term and parlayed that all the way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Right.
That's almost as miraculous as Trump getting elected. So he has a legacy in Georgia. Zal Miller has a legacy in Georgia. Now, you can muse about governors. I think Governor Bonds was perhaps the smartest governor that we've elected in modern times. Sonny Perdue, I would say, I can't think of any legacy that he has, and you really can't think of anything on Joe Frank Harris. Now the QBE has survived in some form of a fashion, but that's the only initiative that you can associate with him. Now he talked about rural economic development. He pushed it, but really not a lot to show about it. He was very big, and George Busby was too, on international trade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Traveled the globe, but so was Zell. And when you start trying to find a legacy for Governor Deal, it might be rolling back some of the mistakes we made as Democrat in the criminal justice system with the one strike you out, two strikes you out, three strikes you out, and so he's rolled back some of that when he's found out that you just can't afford to lock everybody up. And not only can you not afford it, it's not fair in the first place.
Right. So what do you think the greatest threat to Republicans as a governing majority?
The same threat that the Democrats face. Keep in mind, it's just in reverse. You had a change in political demographic. that helped the Republicans retain control after their coming out party. The switching of the legislature to Republicans was made possible by Democrats switching parties to give them the majority. And from that point on, since they've been in power, you've got a change in demographic. They've done nothing to recognize or to appreciate that change in demographics. So they will go by the way as the Democrats, because the Democrats did nothing to address the change in population that was being taken place with the influx of what I refer to as liberal northern Republicans and moderate South Florida and middle Florida and northern Florida Republicans that was moving back to Georgia. And so they did nothing to address their concerns or issues. And they lost control not by a lot, by 3 or 4 percentage points at a statewide level in order to get elected. And the Republicans will do the same.
Well, just wrapping up, what's next for Chairman Scott? You've got how many years left on this term?
Roughly 2.5 years.
So you've got some time to...
Keep in mind now, I take breaks. Between my last elected office and this elected office was 18 years.
Okay.
Now, I think that if I wait another 18 years, I'll be 6 foot under, but I don't know. I haven't given a lot of thought to it. For instance, there's not an office I want to pursue locally. I don't want to be mayor. The only office that I wanted to pursue was chairman of the county commission, and I've achieved that. I still have things to do in the next 2.5 years. The only thing I ever daydreamed about that I haven't done, and that is going to Congress. Will I ever pursue that? I don't know, because the state legislature taught me a lot about Congress. It's disappointing.
Well, on that note, what hasn't been disappointing is our conversation. Thank you very much, Chairman Scott, for participating in the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you very much, sir.
Oh, you're welcome. Take care.